Bronkey, a donkey who was the color of fresh-tilled earth and clouds, and whose neck was permanently adorned with a faded red bandana, stood in the middle of a pasture that was, as the fellow who owned it would say, about as helpful as a bump on a log. Bronkey wasn't doing much of anything. He was just standing, ruminating on the nature of things. A life of quiet rumination, as it turns out, is a plumb fine one, particularly when you're a donkey whose main job is to keep a bunch of chickens from getting ideas above their station. Bronkey wasn't what you'd call a deep thinker, mind you. His thoughts, if you could call them that, tended to circle around a small, manageable handful of topics. Hay, the quality of said hay, the whereabouts of his friend Pig, and the curious existential state of being a creature with hooves instead of feet. His friend, Pig, was an ochre and white fella, with ears that drooped down so far they made him look like he was always listening to something down in the mud. Pig, as was his custom, was currently wallowing in a mud puddle that was, for him, a state of mind as much as a physical location. He wasn't so much moving as he was becoming one with the moist earth. A body might look at him and say he was just a pig in the mud, but Pig was in a state of absolute, unadulterated contentment, a state you could only describe as happy as a dead pig in the sunshine, which, as it turns out, is a lot happier than you might think. He was so still you'd have to get right up on him to check if he wasn't just a pile of clay with a snout. Suddenly, a strange and terrible sound broke the quiet of the afternoon. It was a loud, frustrated grunt, followed by a curse that was a good ways uglier than homemade sin. Bronkey's ears swiveled, a sure sign that the outside world was demanding his attention. The sound was coming from the general direction of the fellow who owned the farm, an old boy with a face that was perpetually sunburned and a disposition that was, on most days, about as sour as a jug of vinegar. The fellow emerged from his little tool shed, a contraption of wood and rusted tin that was, at best, a cattywampus affair. He was holding a shovel and wearing a look that suggested he was madder'n the wet hen. He looked like he was fit to be tied, stomping over to a fresh patch of turned-up dirt near the back fence. Bronkey's eyes, as was his wont, followed the fellow's every move. He wasn't just standing there to be ornery, no sir. He was simply observing, a silent, four-legged witness to the goings-on. "That dag-nabbit gopher," the fellow yelled, kicking at the mound of dirt, "plumb tore up my whole vegetable patch. Digging like a bat out of hell, he is. I'm telling you, that varmint's got about as much sense as a goose." He spat on the ground and then took a swing at the gopher mound with his shovel. Bronkey stood still. Pig, who had not moved a single muscle, just offered a little snort of contentment from his mud puddle. He knew better than to get involved in human affairs, particularly when they involved shovels and cussing. The fellow took a deep breath, or at least as deep a breath as a man with a chest full of anger could take. "I swear to God," he muttered to himself, "if I catch that little varmint, I'm going to tan his hide." He stomped back to the shed, muttering to himself about how he was fixing to find a solution to this gopher problem. The whole ordeal for Bronkey was about as interesting as watching a snail race. He'd seen this show before. The fella gets mad, he yells at the dirt, he goes back inside, and then a new gopher mound shows up the next day. A predictable, but ultimately useless cycle of events. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that were finer than frog's hair, Bronkey and Pig were engaged in a deep conversation. A conversation, that is, which consisted mostly of Pig's occasional grunts and Bronkey's long, drawn-out sighs. "I reckon," Bronkey said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "that the fella's plumb tuckered out from all that hootin' and hollerin' at that gopher." Pig grunted. It was a grunt that could have meant 100 different things, but Bronkey, in his infinite donkey-like wisdom, took it to mean, "You're right, friend. He's been worn slap out by that fool Gopher." "The way I see it," Bronkey continued, "he's trying to play chess with a pigeon. That Gopher ain't thinking about no rules of engagement. He's just digging because that's what a Gopher does. No sense in getting all bowed up about it." Pig let out a series of short, choppy grunts. Bronkey took a moment to translate. "You're saying he's getting all tore up about something that ain't got the sense God gave a goose." Pig grunted once, in solemn agreement. "Well," Bronkey said, shaking his head, "he's got no shield of self-respect. He's letting that little varmint live rent-free in his head, and that's a damn shame. He's got to learn to charge them boundaries." Bronkey shifted his weight from one hoof to another, a small and subtle gesture. "He's all hat and no cattle when it comes to that Gopher." Just then, the fella came back out of his shed, holding a big old firecracker that was probably big enough to blow a hole in a fence post. He lit the fuse and tossed it into the Gopher's hole. The two animals watched, silent, as the fuse sputtered. Then, with a deafening boom, the firecracker exploded, sending a geyser of dirt and grass into the evening air. The fella clapped his hands together, his face split in a wide, triumphant grin. "Now that," he said to himself, "is what I call a solution." Bronkey looked at Pig. Pig looked at Bronkey. Neither of them said a word or made a sound for a long moment. It was a silence so complete you could hear the crickets starting to sing. Then, from the now cratered Gopher hole, a new mound of dirt began to rise, slowly but surely, just a few feet away. A new mound, slightly smaller than the first, but a mound nonetheless. The feller's triumphant grin slowly slid off his face, replaced with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He stood there, silent and motionless, for so long he looked like he was about to fossilize. Pig let out a grunt of pure wisdom. Bronkey sighed. The sun was gone. It was time for bed. This was a battle that was going to rage on, Bronkey reckoned, till the cows come home. He gave a little shake of his head and began to make his way to the barn. Pig, after a final satisfied roll in his mud, followed close behind. They were content. They knew, in a way the fella never would, that you couldn't beat foolishness with fury. You just had to watch it, shake your head, and then go on about your business.